1967 was a great year for Ford Motor Company products. And what do I mean by that? I think the products in 1967 looked pretty good. I have to say 1968, I think, looked a little better across the entire lineup. But for 1967, they were just well-built automobiles. And one of the things that Ford did during this time frame was that they found that customers of their 1950s era cars and even some of the early 1960s era cars had complained previously about some squeaks and rattles. And so Ford actually really upped their game in the late 1960s and installed a bunch of machines at the end of the assembly line made by Burke Porter that actually would jiggle the car significantly before it was done being assembled and out the door to test to see if there were any squeaks and rattles. And it's one of the reasons why if you drive one of these Ford Motor Company products from the late 1960s, that they still are pretty rattle-free almost 60 years later. But let's talk about this particular car, because this is an interesting vehicle. This is a proposal for a 1967 Ford, and can you guess what vehicle this ended up becoming? Well, I'm not going to tell you quite yet. I guess I'll tell you. It was the 1967 Mercury Marquis. Now, in 1967, Mercury decided to introduce a new range-topping automobile, and that was the Marquis. Now, most of you may know the Marquis by the Grand Marquis name, that Panther platform car that was produced for many, many years. But interestingly, there was no Grand Marquis when the car was introduced in 1967. It was only a two-door vehicle and only called the Marquis. In 1969, it would gain another set of doors if you so wanted. You could get two-door, four-door vehicles, convertibles, all in the Marquis name. As Mercury sunset, the Park Lane, which used to be the top-of-the-line four-door vehicle in the model years that went up to 1968. And you could also get a Park Lane two-door hardtop, but that had the fastback roofline similar to the Monterey and the Montclair, whereas the Marquis had a different roofline that was shared with the LTD for 1967. But I have to say that the really interesting thing about this proposal is how different it is from the final version of the 1967 Marquis. And what do I mean by that? Well, it has these horizontal tail lamps that you can see out back. The 1967 Marquis would continue with the Mercury vertical style tail lamps that I think emulated Cadillac or maybe even earlier Pontiacs like the 1964 Pontiacs. But clearly Mercury was looking for something different at first when it introduced the Marquis. And then you also have a much more formal roofline here, a much stiffer profile and upper than what would come out on the 1967 Marquis with the fastback profile. I have to say, I really don't like this proposal very much, and I like the production version much better. I think that C-pillar and the backlight is just too stiff, and the rear quarter glass looks enormous on this. In fact, I would say that this roofline here really resembles what Ford would employ on the LTD for 1968. And interestingly, for whatever reason, the LTD would get its own unique roofline in 1968, separate from what the Marquis was using. The Marquis would just carry over the same roofline from 1967 to 1968, whereas, as I mentioned, the LTD would get a unique roofline. I suspect that was because the Caprice had its own roofline by this point in time. Actually, by 1966, the Caprice coupes had their own roof, and it was a more formal kind of stiff profile. So I think the stiff roof profile trend was just something that was in vogue for the vehicles that were trying to connote luxury at the upper end of the spectrum. And that was something that was certainly true of cars like the Lincoln Continental from 1961, where there was, of course, the Continental roofline where the glass was inset from the outer edge of the door, which this Mercury does not have. And then there were Cadillacs that also had that pretty stiff roof profile. As we continue looking around the car, you notice this crease that runs really the entire length of it, wraps around the back, and in fact kind of carries through the tail lamp lenses. It doesn't really do all that much for me, but I guess it's interesting. It's better than it not being there. I also love the Mercury badging that somebody has applied up abnormally high on this car on the rear quarter panel. Notice that the area behind the backlight, the so-called tulip panel, has these vents. And this was something that Ford Motor Company was doing on a lot of its vehicles during the time, was putting these vents kind of just beneath the backlight or in that general area to help promote interior airflow. And a lot of the cars that Ford produced during this time, the luxury cars, had this feature. It went back, and even some former Thunderbirds had that. Really worked well, and it was great for exhausting cigar smoke and cigarette smoke and just providing fresh air into the cabin. Now notice the wheel covers here. They're the spinner wheel covers. Spinners would actually be outlawed after the 1967 model year in the United States. I believe they would carry on in Canada for some subsequent model years. But this proposal was from 1964. Spinners were cool and were all the rage, and so there you have it. Also notice up front the area that is in front of the front wheel and above the bumper. Looks like that's supposed to be a very large turn signal light. Never really made it through to production on the Marquis in terms of the ones that were produced for 1967, but a lot, again, is different on this model than the production model. Now, at the end of the day, in my humble opinion, Ford ended up going the correct way with the production model here in the 1967 Marquis. And there's quite a few notable differences. We were talking about the fastback style roofline, although it's not quite the fastback from the Monterey, Montclair, and Park Lane, but certainly more fastbacky, if you will, than the proposal. You also have the vertical tail lamps out back. You don't have the vents behind the backlight on this particular Marquis. You do have the spinner wheel covers. You don't have that funky turn signal up front. You do get this, I guess, kind of trim plate. This car is not a cornering lamp car. The optional cornering lamps, there would be a lens there as opposed to that metal trim plate up front in front of the front wheel. And you did get a crease that ran along the side of the car, but you did also get the Continental roofline. You notice the door here has a much larger shoulder in between the glass plane and the outer edge of the door. It didn't exist on the proposal. That had kind of more sheer body sides. And I think that the Ford designers ended up going this way because that shoulder was a trait for Lincoln Mercury products and Lincoln Mercury division products. It was started with that 61 Continental, as I was talking about earlier, and then it proliferated to quite a few Mercurys in the lineup for a number of years. Ford's never really had that little shoulder in the Continental roofline, but that was one design cue that Mercury designers tried to give their Mercurys in order to have them emulate their up-level Lincoln brethren. And that kind of Lincoln-y trend continued on the interior as well. Take a look at this beautiful cloth and leather combination in the Marquis. Yes, that is leather. This was a very upscale interior, lots of buttons and biscuits everywhere on the seats and the door panels. This particular car actually has power vent windows as well as power windows. Yes, you could get the power vent windows, and I think GM was the one that actually made the vent window mirror. It's a little known fact, Ford started using General Motors components back during this time frame. Of course, you can tell it's a 1967 Ford because it's got the flower pot wheel. All of the Fords from 1967 had the flower pot wheel with that big hub on it to help provide absorption in a crash. Of course, the Cyclops speedometer that we introduced for the 1967 model year on Mercurys and would continue through the 1968 model year. And this beautiful kind of brushed linear look that you see to the dash, something that Lincolns would also have. So you were buying really a baby Lincoln in a number of ways. The interior styling, the exterior styling, and the overall build quality on these was just absolutely fantastic and beyond reproach. They're wonderful cars to drive. Now, moving under hood, the standard engine in the Marquis was the 410 cubic inch V8 FE engine that made 330 gross horsepower, topped by a 4-barrel carburetor, and the optional engine was the Q code 428 cubic inch 4 Venturi or 4-barrel carburetor equipped vehicle, and that made 345 gross horsepower. Now, one of the unfortunate things about 1967 Ford products with 4-barrel carburetors is that this was the inaugural year for the Autolite 4300 carburetor, and unfortunately, they were just terrible. They were terrible throughout their run, but they were terrible particularly for the 1967 model year. In fact, there were many, many issues that were redesigned for the 1968 model year just 1 year later. In fact, those inaugural year Autolite 4300s were just 441 cubic feet per minute, or they only flowed 441 cubic feet per minute. In 1968, they would be enlarged to flow 600 cubic feet per minute. But can you imagine that? 441 cubic feet per minute from a 4-barrel carburetor. It's just pretty pathetic. So that was what they used, though, for that year only. And they have some weird features, like the idle speed is set by this big screw in the back that was plugged off the next year. And it didn't really ever quite work all that well. But this was the beginning of the emissions era, hence that carburetor. And even Ford's 460 was designed from the get-go to help improve emissions. So that had already started. Many people think that started in the early 1970s, but it really even started back during this particular time frame. In fact, 1967 was the last year for the air cleaner style that you see here in the U.S. that didn't have the preheater that went down to the exhaust manifold to kind of suck in the hot air when the engine was cold. That would be something that was standard equipment on the 1968 Ford Motor Company products. So what do you think of this proposal? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.